On August 25, 1991, a 21-year-old graduate student in Helsinki named Linus Torvalds posted a message on a Usenet forum announcing he was working on a free operating system. The post is worth quoting for how it begins. "Hello everybody out there using Minix. I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby. Won't be big and professional like GNU." That sentence aged about as poorly as any sentence in the history of technology. "Just a hobby," he wrote. "It won't be big and professional like GNU." 33 years later, that hobby is the foundation of the internet, runs on more than 70% of all smartphones, powers 90% of the world's servers, operates on the International Space Station, and has rovers driving across Mars. And somehow, along the way, it also spawned nearly 1,000 separate versions of itself. There are not 1,000 versions of Windows. There's not 1,000 versions of Mac OS. But there are somewhere between 600 and 1,000 actively maintained Linux distributions, depending on how you count, each with its own community, philosophy, release schedule, and target audience. Some of them are designed for enterprise servers running critical infrastructure. Some are designed to look like Windows for people switching from Microsoft. Some strip the operating system down to the absolute minimum to run on a computer from 2002. Some are built specifically for running on a Raspberry Pi. Why? What is it about Linux that produces this explosion of variety when every other major operating system converges on a single product? The answer is in the history, and the history is genuinely strange. To understand why there are so many Linux distros, you first have to understand why Linux exists at all, and that requires going back further than 1991. The history of Linux is really the history of a decades-long argument about who owns software and whether the answer to that question should matter. And that means starting in 1969, when Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie at Bell Labs created the Unix operating system. Unix was elegant, powerful, and quickly became the operating system of choice for universities and businesses throughout the 1970s. The problem was that the source code was owned by AT&T, and AT&T was not generous about sharing it. In 1977, when the University of California, Berkeley created their own BSD, Berkeley Software Distribution, based on Unix code, the AT&T sued. The resulting legal battles defined what became known as the Unix Wars, a period where the promise of a shared, openly developed operating system ran directly into the reality of corporate copyright protection. In 1983, Richard Stallman responded to the situation by launching the GNU project with the explicit goal of creating a completely free and open replacement for Unix. The name GNU is a recursive acronym standing for GNU's Not Unix, which is exactly the kind of joke that software developers find hilarious. Over the following years, the GNU project recreated many of the essential tools and utilities that made Unix useful: Bash, Tar, Emacs, and hundreds of others. These tools were released under the GNU General Public License, which meant anyone could use, modify, and distribute them provided they made their changes publicly available under the same terms. By the early 1990s, GNU had produced an enormous collection of excellent software. There was just one thing missing: the kernel. A kernel is the core of an operating system, the layer that sits between the hardware and the software and manages resources like CPU, time, and memory. Every piece of software that runs on a computer is communicating with the kernel constantly, asking for processing time, requesting memory allocation, reading from storage, writing to the screen. The kernel is what makes all of those requests work in an orderly way, rather than programs fighting each other for resources and crashing. Without a kernel, GNU's impressive collection of tools was software with no foundation to run on. The GNU project was working on its own kernel called Herd, but Herd suffered from ambition, disagreement within the community, perfectionism, and fundamental architectural decisions that made progress slow. It is still technically in development today. And then Linus Torvalds, frustrated that Unix-like systems were either expensive or legally encumbered, wrote a kernel himself. He called it Linux. It was not intended to be the kernel that GNU needed. It was a personal project. But when Linux was released under the GNU General Public License in late 1992, the combination became something neither project had planned. GNU plus Linux, a complete free operating system that anyone could use, modify, distribute, and build upon without paying anyone or asking anyone's permission. The key word is anyone. That openness is the direct cause of the distro explosion. When software is proprietary, one company controls it and there's one version. When software is open source with a license requiring that modifications remain open, anyone can build anything. And the only limit is how many people have different ideas about what the right thing to build is. It turns out the answer is a lot of people with a lot of different ideas. A Linux distribution, usually shortened to distro, is a complete operating system built around the Linux kernel. The distinction matters because Linux itself is only the kernel. The kernel itself does not come with a user interface, a package manager, configuration tools, or most of the software an ordinary user would want. A distribution takes the kernel, adds all those components, and packages them into something installable. Because the kernel and most of the surrounding software are free and open source, any developer, organization, or community can create their own distribution customized for their specific needs, users, or philosophy. The first distributions appeared in 1993. Soft Landing Linux system was one of the earliest. Slackware, created by Patrick Volkerding, followed shortly and is notable for being the oldest Linux distribution still in active development with its most recent release in 2016. Slackware's philosophy of minimal intervention and keeping the system close to its Unix roots has earned it a devoted community of users who appreciate exactly the characteristics that make it unapproachable to newcomers. That tension between different visions of what Linux should be was present from the beginning, and it is precisely that tension, playing out across thousands of developers with different goals, that produce the distribution landscape that exists today. Debian, released officially in 1996 as version 1.1 with the codename Buzz after the Toy Story character, and named by combining the names of its creator Ian Murdoch and his then-girlfriend Deborah Lynn, became one of the most consequential distributions in Linux history. Every subsequent Debian release carries a Toy Story character name, a tradition that has continued through every version since. Debian's significance comes not just from what it is, but from what it produced. Debian was built around stability, community governance, and a strong commitment to free software principles. It developed the advanced package tool, APT, which made installing and managing software dramatically easier than what came before, and it became the parent of an enormous family tree of derivative distributions. The most significant of Debian's descendants is Ubuntu, first released in 2004 and backed by the British company Canonical. Ubuntu was deliberately designed to be accessible to ordinary computer users rather than technical specialists. It had a clean installation process, sensible defaults, and a semi-annual release schedule with friendly names like Focal Fossa and Jammy Jellyfish. For many people who discovered Linux in the 2000s and 2010s, Ubuntu was their entry point. It spawned its own family of derivatives, including Linux Mint, which emphasized familiarity for Windows users, and Pop! OS, which is particularly popular among developers and gamers. Debian's family tree today includes hundreds of distributions, serving audiences from Raspberry Pi hobbyists to professional servers. Running parallel to the Debian family is the Red Hat family, which began in 1994 with a focus on enterprise reliability and security. While Debian was building a community-governed distribution for general use, Red Hat was building a business around Linux, and the two approaches represent a fundamental philosophical split in how Linux can be sustained as a project. Red Hat developed a business model that became enormously influential. Maintain an open-source operating system, then generate revenue by selling support, consulting, and services to large enterprise clients who need guaranteed uptime and professional assistance. This model proved so successful that IBM acquired Red Hat in 2019 for $34 billion, the largest acquisition in IBM's history. Red Hat's family includes RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux as the commercial product, CentOS as the free community version, and Fedora as the cutting-edge development distribution where new features are tested before making their way into the enterprise products. Fedora is also notable for being the personal choice of Linus Torvalds himself, which carries a certain symbolic weight. The Fedora and Red Hat family uses the RPM package format rather than Debian's DEB format, and this technical distinction has been the source of more community debate than any reasonable person would expect a file format to generate. The third major family emerged from a completely different philosophical direction and represents a strand of Linux thinking that prioritizes user knowledge and system control over convenience. If Debian and Ubuntu represent Linux, saying we will handle the complexity for you, and Red Hat, saying we will handle the complexity for your business, then Arch Linux represents Linux, saying you should understand the complexity yourself. In the early 2000s, as the Debian and Red Hat families grew larger and more complex, some developers wanted something more minimal. Arch Linux, released in 2002, was built around the principle that a distribution should do exactly what you tell it and nothing else. There is no graphical installer. There are no pre-configured defaults. Installing Arch means reading documentation, making choices at every step, and understanding what you're building. The learning curve is steep by design, and the community that formed around Arch is proud of that. Arch uses a rolling release model, meaning instead of major version releases every 6 months or year, the system is continuously updated with small changes. You never reinstall Arch. You just keep it updated, and it evolves continuously. This appeals strongly to users who want to always be running current software without the disruption of major upgrades. If you keep your Arch system updated, you always have the latest version of everything. Arch spawned Manjaro, which adds a more user-friendly installation process while keeping Arch's rolling release model, and has become one of the most popular distributions among experienced Linux users who want current software without building everything from scratch. Alongside these major families are independent distributions serving specific purposes. Alpine Linux is extremely minimal and widely used in containers. Android, used by billions of people, is a heavily modified Linux kernel with a custom runtime. Fire OS on Amazon devices is a further modification. Chrome OS is built on a Linux foundation. The Linux kernel is genuinely everywhere. One additional piece of history deserves mention before the answer to the title question. In 2005, Linus Torvalds was managing the Linux kernel source code using BitKeeper, a proprietary version control system. The Linux community objected to using closed source tools to manage an open source project. Torvalds responded to this criticism by spending a few weeks writing his own version control system from scratch. He created it as a side project while maintaining the side project that became the foundation of the internet. The answer to why there are so many Linux distros is ultimately the same as the answer to why there are so many car models. The Linux kernel is a free engine. Anyone can use it. Different people need different things from the vehicle they build around it. Enterprise administrators need stability above everything else and are willing to pay for support. Home users want something that works out of the box without reading manuals. Developers want the latest tools and do not mind updating constantly. Security researchers want minimal attack surfaces. Hobbyists want to understand every component of their system. Embedded device developers need something that fits in megabytes. Each of these users has a different set of requirements, and because the kernel is free, creating a distribution that serves them precisely costs nothing but developer time and effort. The result is a distribution for almost every conceivable use case, each one maintained by a community of people who care specifically about that use case. When a community decides their current distribution does not exactly match their vision, they fork it, taking the existing code as a starting point and diverging from there. This is called a fork, and the GPL license explicitly permits it. Forks are not failures, they are features. The ability to fork is what allows Linux to simultaneously serve enterprise servers requiring decade-long stability guarantees and hobbyists running bleeding-edge software on hardware assembled from spare parts. The weird history of Linux is the story of a project that was designed by nobody to be anything in particular, built by thousands of volunteers with different visions for what computing could be, and that somehow produced the most important software infrastructure in the history of the internet. Linus Torvalds also created Git as a side project in 2005, when the Linux community objected to using a proprietary version control system for an open source project. He wrote Git in a few weeks to solve the problem himself. Git is now the dominant version control system in the world, used by virtually every software project of significance. The man who said his hobby project would not be big and professional created two of the most consequential pieces of software in computing history, both as side projects, both originally for personal use, both given away free. That is, Linux, in a sentence. Whether there are 1,000 distributions or 10,000, each one is someone's answer to the question of what the perfect computer should feel like. The fact that everyone gets to have their own answer is the point. If you want to try Linux yourself, Ubuntu is the recommended starting point. Download it free at ubuntu.com and run it from a USB drive, without touching your existing installation. If you enjoy the experience, explore the family tree. Every distro started as someone deciding Ubuntu was almost right and wanting to make it slightly more right for them. That sentence describes half the distros on DistroWatch. Subscribe for more tech history videos like this one and drop a comment below telling me which distro you use or which one you want to try first.